told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never say.
Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, The Heartbalm Effect, Book 1 in the Medicine Women of Alaska. Prologue, Fairbanks, Alaska. Paul Livingston stood in the doorway, looked out at all the hopeful medical students, knowing full well that not one of them wanted to practice at his clinic, and called out the name of the next applicant on the list. Dr. Rachel Lavange? An attractive girl with strawberry blonde hair, slender and of medium height, stood up and walked toward him, gazing directly at him as she approached. His senses went on high alert. She radiated a barely contained sexuality, her hips swaying ever so slightly as she drew near to him and then stopped. "You called my name. I'm Dr. Rachel Lavange." "I'm Dr. Livingston, the director of the Gnometown, Alaska Medical Clinic," he said in greeting, extending his right hand. "Pleased to meet you," she said coolly, holding out her hand to shake. Despite the lack of a smile, her grip struck him as strong and firm, and he took comfort from it. Her voice left a taste of velvet in his mouth, and her eyes sparkled blue. The handshake lasted a second too long, and he gazed mesmerized into those shocking blue irises. For one long moment, Dr. Rachel Lavange made him forget he'd ever been married to a woman who'd once told him he meant everything to her. She then betrayed him, divorced him, and married his nemesis and former friend, who was now the head of surgery at Fairbanks Memorial. For one long moment, Dr. Rachel Lavange helped Paul to forget the ex-wife, who presently stood not more than 10 feet away from him, ignoring him and calling out the name of the next applicant on her list of interviewees for a coveted position in her medical practice. He forced himself to remain in the moment. He turned on his heel and gestured to the small office assigned to him for the day's round of interviews. "Please come in. Thank you." She walked into the cramped office and sat down on the solitary chair. He tucked the clipboard under his arm, closed the office door behind him, and sat down in the chair. His heart hung heavy. He already sensed this candidate wasn't going to work out. He'd been running this clinic for 5 years, and he'd seen many residents come and go. He'd always held out the hope that one of them would fall as much in love with this remote section of the Alaskan wilderness as he had, but thus far, no one had stuck. "All business," he said. "Dr. Lavange, you have an impressive curriculum vitae." "I suppose so." He pushed her curriculum vitae to one side and folded his arms across his chest. "So tell me, what made you choose my clinic for your residency?" "I'm out of options," she blurted out, and her cheeks flared scarlet. "Well," he said sarcastically, "I must say I do appreciate your brutal honesty." "Jeezle Pete's, I'm sorry. That was incredibly rude of me." "Well, yes, it was. But it was nice of you to apologize." "I can't believe I said that." This was going nowhere. "I take it Fairbanks Memorial was your first choice?" "Yes, of course," she said, waving her hand distractedly as if to say, "Fairbanks Memorial is everyone's first choice." "A lot of people want to do their residencies at Fairbanks," Paul conceded. An unbelievable number of people. That's why I didn't even make the first cut. I'm waitlisted. She sounded genuinely put out. A little of his former annoyance returned. This uppity female was getting on his nerves. It took him a moment to process why it bothered him so much, then it hit him. This young doctor was so pleased with herself and her perceived abilities, it offended her not to make the first cut at Fairbanks. I take it then, he said dryly, Gnometown was your second choice? Actually, Gnometown's way down on my list. I think it's 10th. I'm delighted you saw fit to interview with me. She gazed at him, and again, despite his irritation, she struck him to the core with her piercing blue eyes. I'm being a terrible snot, aren't I? He nodded. Yes, she said sadly, then chuckled. I'm being a terrible snot. Matter of fact, I had to look Gnometown up on a map. Until I saw your listing, I'd never heard of this clinic before in my life. I'm getting all warm and squishy inside. She smiled again. She knocked him off guard by the sweetness of her manner. If we're being brutally honest here, I've got to tell you, the Mayo Clinic was my first choice, but I didn't make the first cut, and so I'm on the waiting list. Mayo Clinic, Yes, it's where my father wanted me to practice, and it's got the additional advantage of being close to my hometown. So the minute Mayo calls, you'll be packing your bags, right? He said evenly. I'm terribly sorry. To her credit, she did look a bit contrite. No matter, he said, tossing the clipboard onto the desk. I'm planning to install a revolving door at the front entrance, just so the residents know how quickly they can leave. Oh. A silence filled the space between them. Anyway, as you're here, I may as well tell you about the clinic, especially if you find it within yourself to come practice with us. Oh, well, sure. Well, that's what I call a rousing recommendation. He launched into his spiel. I founded the Gnometown Clinic 5 years ago with a grant from the federal government and with some private money from investors. Oh, I see. We provide full medical services to all the local people. Once a month, I drive out to see my patients at the Tlingit Reservation. Once a month? Yes, I prefer to see my patients at the clinic, but once every month or so, I head out to the Tlingit Reservation to treat those members of the tribe who either can't afford to drive down to the clinic or who can't physically manage the trip. Do you perform surgery there? Yes, but only with a local anesthetic. If the patient requires surgery with a general, then I ship them out to the main hospital. To Fairbanks Memorial, where Dr. Frank Sturgis runs the surgery unit? Yes, he said tersely, bristling at the name of his former friend. You'll get a first-rate experience at the Gnometown Clinic if you elect to do your residency here. As I said before, she continued, apparently unaware she'd offended him, I'm on the wait list for Mayo, and I'm also interviewing at Fairbanks Memorial. There's an opening in the pediatric oncology unit, but I do appreciate the chance to meet you, Dr. Livingston. Well, that's what I call a bum's rush out the door. At least she had good manners, and she's pretty. She's mighty pretty, too. He rose to his feet the same moment she did, and they shook hands earnestly across the particle wood desk. Clearly, she was giving him the brush off. It was one of those, thanks for the interview at your pitiful little clinic, but I'd much rather practice with the big boys if it's all the same to you, Doc. The words unspoken hovered in his mind. He knew perfectly well that when the letter of acceptance arrived in the mail, she'd send a polite but firm rejection. Such a shame, too, because she was the most attractive woman he'd met in a long time. He walked her to the door and watched as she returned to her seat. She had one more interview to go with his ex-wife for the pediatric oncology opening at Fairbanks Memorial. He stood in the waiting room and called out the name of the third and last candidate to apply for the Gnometown Clinic. Nothing. He called out the name again, a bit louder this time. A secretary hurried forward. "Oh, Dr. Livingston, that applicant withdrew his name." "Oh, of course." His ex-wife walked her latest applicant out of the interview room and called out the name of the next. "Dr. Lavange?" "Yes." Rachel Lavange rose gracefully from her chair and walked over to greet Anna. "Nice to meet you," Anna said. "Please come this way, Dr. Lavange." Feeling like a chump, Paul watched, helpless to stop himself, as Dr. Lavange followed Anna into the interview room. But then a curious thing happened. Dr. Lavange stopped at the door, turned her head, and smiled at him. Wow. Oh, wow. Struck by the lethal intensity of those sharp blue eyes, he wondered and hoped, sincerely hoped, he'd get the chance to see her again. But then again, who was he kidding, right?
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said.